I'm back out here in the Sonoran Desert, Arizona for a rematch for the 24 hours in the Old Pueblo. And to give myself a fighting chance, the good folks at Manitou have sent me over some box fresh suspension. So today in this video, I'm going to go through all sort of base settings, setup tricks and tips. And that can be whether you're doing a 24-hour epic or shredding downhill. So let's get out of the heat. I've got a primarily XC focused bike here. Let's go find some different suspension and head back to the tech set. And here we are then, back in the set, somewhere considerably less dusty and less UV rays on my brain. Now the race is done out at the Old Pueblo, but if you want to see that video, you're gonna have to wait just a couple of days more until this weekend when the full race video is released. Did I make it? Did I survive? Or did we have another hospital disaster? Stay tuned to find out. But today, obviously, we're going to be talking all about suspension setup. And in this video, we're going to be focused primarily around air suspension. So if you have a coil fork or a coil shock, well, don't worry, we've got tons of videos on gmbntech for you to check out, but this is going to be predominantly air suspension related. My suspension then in the desert was obviously primarily XC focused, as you can see here on the old Orbea Royds. It had the R8 on the front, but the same principles that we're going to talk about, which were done for this bike, can be transferred across to all other kinds of bikes. So trail, enduro, downhill, anything sort of with suspension on it. While we generally tend to think obviously that, you know, setting up suspension on downhill bikes and enduro bikes is more important because, well, more suspension, more setup and fiddling required. XC bikes are just as important as well. It's not a case of just set and forget. Oh no, indeed. Less suspension, actually. I think it needs to work better. So let's dive on into the video where we're going to be looking, to begin with, at three sort of key areas: air pressure or sag, rebound, and compression. So let's kick things off with air pressure or sag. Now, thanks to Manitou for making the video happen. You can see we've got a variety of their different forks here, from cross-country, enduro to downhill. And they all run off of what's sort of essentially called an air spring. Confusing terminology, I know, but in one side of the fork, there is a valve on the top and you top up the air pressure within that chamber to determine just how hard or soft that fork's going to feel. So when it comes to air pressure or sag, which we're going to get onto in a minute, the more air or pressure that you put into the fork or the rear shock, the firmer it's going to get. And then when you sit or stand on your bike, that amount that it compresses is called sag. And it's this sag which will determine sort of just how well it's going to track the ground. So how do we control or alter this pressure and sag? Well, normally by a Schrader valve that's on the top of your fork leg or sometimes tucked around the body of the rear shock. And it's by using a specific shock pump, which goes up to a much higher pressure than what your tires and that will, that we can actually add or take away air in the body or the leg of the fork or shock. This fork leg houses the air spring, as you can see. This is the same for all air forks. Using mine here as an example, the air spring in here is the same as that super plush Dorado air spring that came from the legendary downhill fork of the same name. But it can be found throughout their range of forks, from the XC sort of downcountry R8 that you can see here, through to their longer travel trail and enduro fork. On your rear shock, it'll be a bit more obvious, but they can still be tucked away. Using a shock pump, you can add or remove air to get the sag exactly how you want it, but more on that later on in the video. Now it's time for compression, and yep, you guessed it, it's the damping applied to your fork or shock when it's being compressed. We need this to help slow down and control the suspension as it compresses to allow it to absorb impacts even better. This can be done externally on most forks via a dial or a lever at the top of the fork. Now, on Manitou's, it is a red dial, as you can see on the top of the fork right now. But on a lot of manufacturers, it can be done via a blue dial. And on your rear shock, it will be often a multi-position lever, but sometimes it is a dial as well. You can see on a lot of suspension, it is going to be blue in color, but like I said, on the Manitou's here, is also red. Rebound now, everybody. Now, rebound damping refers to essentially the damping used to control the speed at which your fork returns back to its sort of full travel or partway through the travel if it's constantly getting compressed. Now, this is really important because it's going to play a vital role in how your fork reacts when riding over rough ground. If you have too much rebound wound on, it's going to feel quite sluggish and it's not going to come back through its travel enough to absorb the next hit. Too little and it's going to feel quite pogo-y and bouncy and just, rebounding too fast, it can actually make the track feel even rougher. Now, the rebound dials or adjusters can be located in different places depending on the shock. On forks, it's often located, or pretty much always located, at the bottom of the fork leg. And on a Manitou, it's a blue dial. On some other fork manufacturers, it's a red dial. On a shock, well, this is where it can be a little bit more hidden. So you've just got to keep an eye out for the color of those dials if your shock does have it. That's all the pieces of the puzzle then. Let's start putting them together. First up, let's set up the sag on our rear shock. Now, to do this, you're gonna need the compression and the rebound wound all the way open, and you're gonna need to be fully kitted up. So as a general rule of thumb, on the rear shock, you're gonna be looking at around the 20 to 30% sag mark. Now, that's the suspension sitting down into its travel about 20 to 30%. Now, this can vary across all riders, obviously, in personal preference, but that's a general guideline. Now, a lot of manufacturers, Manitou included, will obviously have a guideline, a setup guide, if you like, in which you can follow to get this exact number. Obviously, as I said earlier in the video, sag is achieved or found out by adding or removing pressure in the shock. So if you're new to it and you're adding pressure into your rear shock, just obviously make sure you don't go above the maximum pressure mark, as well, that could end badly. So how do we know what 20 to 30% is? Well, first up, you need to know the stroke of your shock. This is different to its travel. From there, you can then figure out what that 20 to 30% is. Now, bear in mind, you might set it up and blow through the suspension too much. You might be compressing it all the way, bottoming out if you like, which we're going to get onto. But if that is the case, it's a sign you're probably going to need to add more air pressure. Let's use my cross-country bike here as an example. The rear shock on that has 120 mil of travel, yet has a stroke length of 50 millimeters. So if we were to take our 20 to 30% of that 50 mil stroke, that means the sag is going to be between 10 and 15 millimeters. How do we find out just how much sag there is? Well, look, on a rear shock, you generally have a little rubber O-ring. So as I said before, what you do is slide the O-ring all the way up to the shock body there, all the way up as far as it will go. Kitted up, you're going to carefully sit on your bike. Be careful here not to sort of dump your weight on it, not to bounce, anything like that, because it's going to go further than what it should do. Lower your weight so that the shock gently compresses. That's going to push the O-ring to where the bike is sort of sitting loaded, if you like, and then from there, carefully stand back up. And it's that measurement between the shock body and where the O-ring then sits that you want to take a measurement of. That is what should be between 20 and 30%. What about when it comes to setting up the sag on the front of the bike? Well, it's similar to the rear shock. However, instead of looking at that stroke length, it's total amount of travel. So you really need to know exactly how much travel you've got here. So if you've got an adjustable fork like the Mezza here, which can go from 160 up to 190, you need to know exactly where you're at. Likewise, on the R8, this is a 100 mil travel fork I've got on this bike right here. So you're setting up that 20 to 30%, you need to know exactly how much travel you do have. Hop onto the bike, fully kitted up again, pedals nice and level. Now at this point, if you're leaning against a wall, just take the bike so the bars are off the wall so it can move up and down nice and freely. Or if you've got a friend, he can just sort of hold the front wheel so that it means that there's nothing impeding the movement of the fork. Stand up on the bike, pedals level, weight slightly over the front as if you were sort of in that attack position. And then again, with that O-ring pushed all the way down to the seal, just load the fork as you would. Try not to bounce it, you don't want to do that. And that O-ring is going to move up and give you a rough indication of where that sag is. But with sag done, it's on to compression. Compression or compression damping, depending on how you have this set up, is going to adjust or alter how soft or firm the fork feels. Having it wound fully open is going to give a much more softer and supple ride on your suspension. Having it wound all the way closed is going to make it feel much more firmer and more supportive. To adjust compression, there's normally obviously a lever or dial, as I previously said. When it comes to rear shocks then, it's pretty straightforward adjusting the compression. You generally have an open and closed kind of switch, and you can clearly see that on this Manitou shock here. We've got a party, which is open, and a work, which is closed. And what that's doing is affecting the sort of low speed compression most of all. Party being open, it's allowing the shock to be as soft as it possibly can. Closed, or the work setting, well, the other end of the scale, which is why it's sometimes called a climb switch. So if you're climbing, obviously up a big climb, tarmac, off-road, on-road, whatever, you want to firm up that rear shock. So you'd switch it into work mode according to this one. and that's going to firm up the shock. It's generally never a lockout, although you do find lockout switches on a lot of cross-country bikes, so we do actually have it on this one here, and that's going to basically lock the shock out completely so that it's as efficient as it possibly can. Up front, it's a similar story, although a lot less of the time, instead of there being a switch or a lever, it's often a set of dials. Now you just turn the dials one way or the open, it'll have a plus and a minus. Plus being more, minus being less, so open. Minus is generally always open. And you'll want to adjust this accordingly. So if it's getting rowdy or you ride a lot of really rowdy terrain, you're going to want to add compression on. Dial that thing up to the pluses. Sometimes it'll be clickers, so you can just click, 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 click. You can feel it as it goes. Sometimes it's a much smoother feel, so you've just got to know what's working on your suspension, of course. For general riding, though, I would always sort of suggest adding a bit of compression on, but that's something that you can fine-tune to yourself. If the tracks are getting much rougher, really chunky, really rocky, or really steep on the downhills, then that's where you're going to want to add that compression. Right, we're going to dive in a little bit deeper now and talk about high and low speed compression. Now this can be separate dials, but generally is one and the same. You also get high and low speed rebound, but we're going to get onto that a little bit later. Now what high and low speed compression refers to is actually not the speed at which you're riding your bike, it's the speed in which your suspension is moving. So think of it this way. High speed compression is essentially all those really fast little bumps really close together. So if you're hammering through a rock or root garden or over lots of braking bumps, say that suspension's working really fast, you just da, 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 da. However, slow speed compression, think about it when you're going around a big long berm or over rollers or sort of jumps and things like that. The suspension is moving, it's working a lot slower pace. So where and why would we adjust low and high speed compression? Well, if you find that your bike is diving too much on all that really chunky, choppy stuff, then you're going to need to add more high-speed compression. That's going to give it a little bit more support when it's constantly moving really fast like this. If you're riding trails that require sort of a lot of pumping and slowly sort of moving the bike around from side to side, much smoother trails generally, hitting jumps, drops, that low-speed compression is where you're going to maybe need to wind it on there. So that it actually adds a bit of firmness at those lower paces when that shock's sort of slowly compressing like this, or that fork is slowly compressing. That's where you're adding on more damping there. And remember, when you're adding compression on, slow speed, high speed, whichever, it needs to balance out at both ends of the bike. So you can't wound on loads of damping at the front end of the bike, but the back end's still soft, because it's not going to make it feel balanced. Ideally, you want your bike to feel nice and balanced as it compresses at both ends. Now, do remember, obviously, this is a massive amount of knowledge to try and sort of wrap your head around. And a lot of the times there are setup guides and setup manuals for all of these types of forks and manufacturers out there. So refer back to those, and they'll give really good base settings according to sort of rider weight, riding style and things like that. So you can sort of get a good, like we said, sort of level line to go from and then go for some rides. And the more you ride your bike and the more you get a feel for it, the more you'll know sort of what you need to do to it to make it work exactly for you. Okay, let's talk a rebound now. So obviously the speed at which that fork or shock returns out of being compressed. Now, if your rebound is too fast, your bike is going to feel, like I said, a pogo stick. It's going to be pinging back at you and actually can sort of make things feel bumpier because it's just da-doing, da-doing, da-doing. It's an uncomfortable ride. Too slow and you get the exact opposite problem, of course, but it's what's called as packing down. So what is packing down? Well, it's essentially where your forks are compressing. Because the rebound is so slow, you don't get the full amount of travel back. They stay quite low down in their travel. You take another hit, it compresses and it's not rebounding quick enough. So it gets lower and lower to a point where it sits really low in its travel and you're not really optimizing the full use of that fork. So what is the dream setup? Well, what is the perfect rebound? Well, it's rider dependent, of course, and course dependent. Remember, all this sort of setting up can vary depending on what sort of terrain and course you're riding. But when it comes to rebound, well, let's face it, you don't want it so fast that it's pinging back up through its travel or its stroke, if you like, and topping out, making a bit of a clunk as it hits the end of that. And at the same time, you don't want it to be doing what we said, that packing down. You want to be getting the full use. So you're going to have a little experiment here. But the smoother the course, generally what I think sometimes is the slower the rebound. The faster the course or the rougher the course, Well, you want to sometimes speed that rebound up to a degree. You don't want to go overkill with it because, like I said, fast courses, if you make that rebound really fast, it can actually make it feel rougher on rougher terrain. So it's all about getting the balance. So remember then, when you're setting it up, your rebound dial is generally at the bottom of the fork. Plus is adding rebound on, minus is taking it off. And if you want to go really in depth with your suspension setup, we do obviously have a video linked in the description down below. But look, if you're in a car park sort of doing the gravel car park kind of test, or there's a curb nearby, a really good thing is like if you set your rebound up to where you think it should be, if you ride off of that curb or up the curb sometimes, because you'll feel that rebound coming back, if it does feel like it's absorbing that hit nicely, but then sort of rebounding too quick, as I said, it's a note just to give it a few extra clicks and wind on some rebound and slow it down a touch, and vice versa as well before you get on the trail. Last then, but by no means least, of course, is fine-tuning your suspension. Now, we haven't talked about tokens or volume spacers yet. Essentially, these are small bands or pieces of plastic that go into your fork leg or go into the can of the rear shock here to change the volume, the air volume inside that part of the suspension. Now, by adding a volume spacer or a token, you're reducing the amount of air in there. And what this is going to affect on the suspension is the way it ramps up through its travel, if you like. What that is so imagine a very linear piece of suspension or a very linear shock. It will compress at the same rate all the way through. By adding a token, it compresses at that same rate, and then that firms up towards the end of the stroke. The more tokens, the more volume spacers that you add, the quicker it's going to ramp up, the quicker it's going to firm up. Now this is obviously, again, another piece of the puzzle that you need to try and figure out when, like I said, it does come to fine tuning. Now what I would recommend, so for myself, I ride my bikes pretty hard, so I like the suspension to be fairly firm. I like that first bit to be quite soft and then for it to ramp up so I don't blow through the travel. On something like the Mezza here, it's got Manitou's IVA, internal volume adjust, and it's a similar sort of thing by using these sort of plastic chips, if you like, to adjust that volume in the air chamber. And it just makes it really nice and simple. And of course, if you are going to be fiddling around with your suspension, my top tip is tune or change one bit at a time, or one area, be it sag, rebound, compression. Do each one individually, not all at the same time. That way you can isolate each one and see how it feels, and then tune it exactly how you want it, and then you can move on to the next. And then you know you've got these variables. Write a little book down, jot down how many clicks or how much air pressure you've got, and then it really means that you can tune your suspension exactly as you want it. But hey, that's it. I'm done here in the tech set. It's nice to get out of the desert and out of the dust. Look, don't forget the full Old Pueblo race video is coming this weekend, so stay tuned to GMBN to go and check that out to see if, like I said, I did survive or whether this one put me in hospital again. It didn't, I promise.